We also thank our members who have paid their annual dues. Your dues provide essential primary funding for RAS Korea, and we appreciate your support. Those in attendance tonight who are not yet paid members are invited to consider becoming a member. See our website at raskb.com for details. For those who are visiting tonight, we suggest a one-time contribution of 10,000 won or $10 US. Full-time students may contribute half that amount. Please refer to the donation page on the screen for PayPal and bank transfer information. We are delighted tonight to have Simon Cockrell with us. He is GM of Cockrell Tours and has been working for about 20 years in DPRK tourism and engagement. He will tell us what it's like to arrange visits and take part in various activities and projects in North Korea. We'll learn about the demands, limitations, and expectations of both sides of the equation. After Simon's lecture, we'll have some time for questions. Now, if you'll please be sure to mute your mic, and that'll help reduce background noise. We will now turn the time to Simon. Take it away, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for taking your valuable time to attend. Big thanks to the RAS for inviting me on and indulging me, as it were. I'd first like to apologize that I've come down with quite a severe cold, so my voice sounds a bit funny and I may have to pause every so often to drink something or to blow my nose, but I'll try and minimize that, and I'll try and get through this session without sounding too awful at the end, but please bear with me anyway. Be kind. So yeah, it is a great opportunity to be given the opportunity to give the 1427th lecture. That's great. I'm going to put up some pictures in a minute. Now, I'm not going to sit here and describe what each picture is because I'm not a huge fan of that kind of presentation. That's a bit sort of grandma's slideshow for me. So I'm going to put up some pictures that were taken mostly by the Magnum photographer Karl de Kaiser on a trip, series of trips that we organized for him a couple of years ago. And basically they're much better than the pictures I've taken, but they're the kind of thing that people might see going around Pyongyang. So I think that that may be interesting. So let me attempt to activate that, that now. Wish me luck. Let's see if this works. So hopefully you'll be seeing a slideshow of pictures around North Korea progressing every 20 or 30 seconds or so.
Looking good, looking good. Go ahead.
Great. So I'm Simon Cockrell. I'm the general manager of Cockrell Tours, and we are a Beijing-based travel company who are the market leaders in arranging tourist trips to North Korea. And we also do trips to places such as Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Mongolia, remote parts of Russia, Kazakhstan, and so on. But North Korea is very much our bread and butter, our original destination, and the place that we specialize in and are known for specializing in. We're also involved in various non-tourism projects in fields such as filmmaking, sports events, school trips, teaching trips, humanitarian projects, publishing books, and more. So the common theme in these projects I consider to be engagement, to get as many North Koreans interacting with as many non-North Koreans as possible, broadly speaking, in as many different circumstances as possible too, to expose North Koreans to as much foreign life as possible, to expose non-North Koreans to as much information and experience of North Korea as possible. So this can be very difficult, especially given all the preconceptions and the tendency for North Korea to be reported on only for the major and macro scale events. And the focus of most reporting on North Korea is all on one man rather than the rest of the kind of pyramid of society beneath him, which is understandable, of course. For the vast amount of myths, assumptions, misinformation, disinformation, and general BS that kind of surrounds and permeates any discussion on North Korea, it's very hard to cut through, very hard to know what's true and what's not. So, of course, this cloud of confusion is not something I'm going to just blame on the media or any one party. It's the natural consequence of dealing with a country whose government deliberately limits the information that flows to the outside world, and that which goes the other way too. And they act to stunt what people inside the DPRK can possibly know about the rest of the world, as well as the need for news consumers to be entertained and engaged by what they read and watch. So this means that the banality of everyday life is usually overlooked or under-prioritized in favor of the big stories, the nukes, the threats, the rumors, the sanctions, the human rights issues, the big names, and the big personalities. This is all unfortunate, but it's predictable and understandable, I believe, and it's not the result of a broad conspiracy to demonize and depersonalize in North Korea, as is sometimes claimed. However, this focus on the big issues and general ignoring of the presence of millions of people who exist outside these issues in North Korea is something that we do try to overcome somewhat. So I should add here that we're well aware of the very reason that people who become our clients in visiting the country even know about North Korea is likely because of these big and often crazy stories. So they do serve to engage people with the existence of North Korea in the first place, which can develop into an interest to visit, to study, and learn about the place, which is to be encouraged. It's easy to show people the madness and the idiosyncrasies of North Korea. They're on plain display and they're widely known and reported. Even if many of these stories are completely untrue, there's plenty which is true or true enough to show that this country is one which is unique and difficult to understand. Engagement with people in that country is not easy. There are many barriers and institutional obstructions to this. Most people in the world have never met anyone from North Korea, have never interacted with a North Korean either. It's difficult to do that without being there. It's easier for people in Seoul. I'm sure there's many of you here in Seoul who you can meet former North Koreans, let's say, euphemistically, of course, and for people in parts of China to see North Koreans in DPRK restaurants and so on. But even in these cases, it's very limited, with few North Koreans going overseas and the vast majority of those chosen few being very limited in where they go and the freedom that they have to move around and interact with foreigners, assuming that they even want to. This contributes to the unknownness of the place even more. But as we all know, when someone goes to North Korea in person, they have a lot of restraints and limitations on what they can do, where they can go, and what interaction and engagement they can experience. So many that it's commonly claimed that tourism and visiting there is some kind of show or subject to some kind of show, that anyone interacted with there is a performer of some sort, and that the whole experience is at best a sham, and at worst it's a contribution to sustaining the system of North Korea itself. I and my company, we very much reject this assertion and assumption. We've experienced a great many moments of interaction, spontaneous and planned. We've seen people we know develop their ideas and views of the world and its myriad peoples and experiences. And we've seen how simple human contact can make a difference. On a micro scale, of course. I'm not going to claim that tourism is some kind of magic bullet for opening up a closed society and system, but it's self-evident to me that not engaging and not interacting is less beneficial than small amounts of interaction and engagement. So this is a kind of first principle that we base our work on. So what do I mean by engagement? We take a simple view of it. It can be deep or shallow, ephemeral or substantial. Of course, the deep and substantial version is best to share more and for people to get to know and understand each other, but even the shallow and ephemeral moments have value. So in North Korea, as I'm sure you know, all narratives are controlled by the powers that be. Education, news, propaganda, public opinion. In general, it's all top down, and opinions are supposed to be given to people from above and to be accepted and repeated unconditionally and assumed as one's own. This is no secret. The picture painted of foreigners in North Korea is relentlessly negative. The incidences of positive portrayals of foreigners in DPRK media of any kind are very rare, especially when compared to the times when foreigners and foreign society, either specific countries and societies or the general foreign world, are shown to be conspiring against the DPRK, engaged in dishonest and abusive policies, or simply up to no good. It's therefore no surprise at all that the general view among people in North Korea is that foreigners are not to be trusted, or to be understood, or to be engaged with. This is tragic and very saddening, but it is understanding given what they know about us. Of course, this works the other way too. It's easy to see the people of North Korea as representatives of the excesses of their state, but generally those who are willing to visit the country are, at least ostensibly, able to know that there is a difference between the people in a state and those who are of the state. So given that the population of the DPRK is programmed to be so anti-foreign and to assume assume the worst, it really doesn't take that much to make small and incremental tiny gains against this pernicious perception. So smiles, handshakes, waves, micro interactions in shops, on the street, in parks, anywhere really, these all work against the message that foreigners are always up to no good. These interactions are not going to change minds on the spot, but they can plant the seed that the principle that foreigners are no good might be wrong sometimes. And thus, that may lead, in some cases, to questioning the principle that foreigners are in the wrong, and who knows what other principles. So this is slow work, and successes are not immediately evident, and they may remain obscured and hidden for a long time, many years. But it is real, and we have experienced changes in attitude, small and incremental, of course, over the years. These are mostly anecdotal changes, but I can assure you that they're very real. So for anyone who takes the position that the very act of going to North Korea and accepting the limits and restrictions imposed on visitors is somehow an act innately supportive of the DPRK government, our experience does show that that's a false proposition. The government there paints one image of foreigners, and we slowly paint another one. And we paint a more three-dimensional picture, but it does take much more time to paint, to very stretch this metaphor a bit too far, I think. This, I think, is important work. Of course, anyone can rhetorically say that they, of course, accept that the 24+ million people in North Korea are not responsible for the negative things that put their country in the news all the time, but to actually act to try to bring an element of humanity to these people is something different and requires more effort to engage than it takes to criticize. This is effort that we're glad to make our vocation and our profession. I mentioned before the limitations and rules that tourists and visitors are bound by. Let me outline these in brief. I'm sure some people know about them, but let me, you can put the kettle on if you're not interested in this part. Tourists going to North Korea can't just get a visa and show up and then do what they want. Everything has to be planned in advance. The minimum requirement is the same as the maximum requirement, meaning that everything must be arranged. Fundamentally, everybody must be part of a group. This group can be as small as one person, though, but the rules remain the same. Tourists must have tour guides with them. These are not the same as minders, please note. Usually 2 guides per group. These people are there for translation, arranging the places to visit, taking care of the visitor, and generally being with them all the time. In addition to those guides, there's a driver to move everyone around. The itinerary of any visit has to be planned in advance. This is not to say that there's simply one possible itinerary dictated from above, which is a common belief, but we, for one, make all the itineraries individually, tailoring them as much as possible, visiting as many different places as possible, taking part in as many activities as possible. But frankly, for most visitors, it's actually the highlights they're looking for. So many tours do tend to focus on the kind of canon of sites in the country, but this is normal. If you go to Paris for the first time, you will probably go to the Louvre, the Eiffel Tower, the Arch of Triumph, not because you have to, but because they're the main sites. And when time allows, you can make it more esoteric and specialized. Same is true of visiting the DPRK. Tourists have to ask before they take pictures. The guides know the rules. If they visit sites associated with the DPRK's leaders, which are not mandatory, by the way, they're asked to dress in a certain way, behave in a certain way, engage in the local rituals, bowing to statues and so on. When changes to the itinerary are requested, it's sometimes possible if you ask early enough, and sometimes not possible. Often it's not known why something is or is not possible, but it's best to plan ahead, basically. Tourists cannot wander alone without guides anywhere. The reason given is usually safety, but the people claiming this will also claim that they have no crime in their country. So how they reconcile that is unclear. Guides will often also say that this is for convenience, as the visitor likely speaks no Korean. But what if the visitor does speak Korean? And where else in the world is local language fluency a prerequisite for being able to go for a walk? Anyway, this rule is a rule because it is a rule. It isn't up to the guides or their employer. It just simply is. So for a tourist to put up with all these unnecessary restrictions, as well as the general inconvenience of being in North Korea, the lack of internet, for example, and still go there, does show dedication to understanding a place, to making an effort. And for that, I salute anyone who takes a trip there. It's an act that requires more effort than going almost anywhere else, even if you get moved around and treated like you're on some kind of school trip when you're actually in the country. Very often, tourists will make a point of telling us that they wish to interact with local people as much as possible when they're in the country. Of course, we assume that to be the case. I've never met anyone who was going to North Korea but didn't want to maximize interaction with people. So for anyone looking to go there, we already know that you want to maximize interaction with people. So don't worry about that. And we do our very best to get as much as possible. We just ask people to understand that the most you can hope for is far less than it should be. But what should it be? In my opinion, even within the current framework, there should be a lot more opportunity to do more. It's a shame that this hasn't happened, I don't see why foreign visitors cannot roam Pyongyang at will. Use public transport, take taxis, go to local shops and so on. While the standards of all these things are not as high as the guides and authorities like to show visitors, they're still good enough. And they're still better than many places that many well-traveled and worldly people will have seen before. In fact, more exposure to this banality of normality in Pyongyang would help get rid of some of the more fantastic assumptions people make about fake fruit in shop windows and so on, local people using public transport being actors planted there, that kind of thing. I also think that broadening the range of places people can stay should have happened. It's too much to hope that youth hostels and so on would open in the main cities and villages by now. But what about homestays at approved apartments in the main cities? What about the chance to visit people that you know at their homes? What about more access to local bars? This is all something to happen in the future, near future or far future. We don't know. The key thing to remember about visiting North Korea, though, is that the default position there is that everything is not possible and everything cannot be done, apart from those things which are approved and allowed. Anywhere else in the world, the situation is the reverse, where everything is allowed apart from that which is not. So this is frustrating, and it does make the question of why something would not be allowed somewhat moot, because everything is not allowed until it is allowed. So I know this can be a bit complicated, but that's the fundamental difference between what you can do in North Korea and what you can do anywhere else. So this is frustrating, not just for me and my colleagues, but also for the tour guides we work with in North Korea. So on the subject of these guides, visitors take a range of approaches to dealing with their guides. So some are suspicious of them and see them as agents of the state that are there to restrict them on what they can see and do, to control them and direct them, and to brainwash and manipulate them. These visitors see the guides simply as North Korea made flesh, and this I believe to be an error. The reality is that being a tour guide in North Korea is a complicated thing. They work for companies rather than the government. Of course, they're state-owned companies, but all companies are state-owned, so that's a tautology. They have to learn all the usual tour guide stuff, of course, how tall something is, what year this happened, and so on. But they also have to know the rules of a place that visitors do not know the rules of. Also, they're held responsible for the actions and acts of their tourists too, which has led, in the worst cases, to some guides losing their jobs, at least in the past. Some of them are party members, some are army veterans, most of them are neither. Actually, the job is a good one, but it's not the best one that the aspirational classes of people can wish to have. There are other jobs. If you meet a tour guide there and you ask them their dream job, it's usually something else, actually. These guides, they spend almost no holidays with their family, but they do benefit from a higher economic level than the average person, most certainly. So there's a trade-off when you talk to guides about the job. Some do see it as a vocation that they've sought after. Others see it as a stepping stone to something better. So there's a great plurality within this core of people, which I think is not usually appreciated by a lot of people who just see them as operatives of the North Korean state, and guards and spies and so on. One interesting anecdote I would like to relate that speaks to me about the difference that we find among the guides is that about a decade ago, I was speaking to one senior guide, an old, let's say a late middle-aged man by now, and he was complaining about a lot of the new guides that had recently started working for the company. They're mostly young women. He found them to be a bit frivolous and believed they didn't really represent the country as well as serious people like himself. And he told me that there were now two kinds of guides in his opinion. And he said, those who know a lot about Marxism, Leninism, and those who like to drink peach juice. So I have to say that it was a bit mean-spirited of him to say that and a bit blunt, but there is a little bit of truth to that. So, you know, there are a lot of people who like to drink peach juice, and those who like it the most they tend to be the ones who perhaps know the least about the deeper political basis for the position that North Korea holds. So to this day, I do think about some people I meet there and consider whether they're more of a peach juice drinker or a Marxist-Leninist. But to be frank, it's good to have both. And the reality is that there's really a spectrum between them too. It's a non-binary position, like so many other things, of course. I would like to speak, I'm sorry, my throat is going a bit. I'd like to speak a little bit about some of the people and organizations that we work with. And actually, I'll put up a different slideshow just that features more people, some of our partners and colleagues and so on. in North Korea. So let me just switch to that one. Bear with me, please. Let's go with that one. So you may recognize me, at least in here. So Cockrell Tours works with a variety of DPRK organizations in the work that we do. So I'd like to outline this in a bit of detail to show that the challenges and difficulties of each organization are different, mainly down to the motivations of each organization being different. This has demonstrated to us over the years the falsity of assuming that North Korea operates as some kind of hive mind or with one single overriding motivation or ideology in dealing with foreigners. Very often people will ask, what does North Korea want with this? Why does North Korea do this? What is North Korea thinking about such and such a thing? But simply put, there's no North Korea really beyond a geographical location made up of mountains, and rivers, and settlements, and so on. When we deal with North Korea, it's individual organizations and individual people, and we have to be aware of the needs and regulations and motivations of each of them in dealing with us. So to be honest, this should be self-evident. It's true everywhere after all, but it's a basic truth often overlooked when people look at North Korea. Of course, this isn't to say that there are some general a priori assumptions to make when dealing with any organization or person in the DPRK, that they follow the line of their government and party, that anything related in any way with their leaders is of the utmost sensitivity, and so best to be avoided as much as possible, in our opinion. But the key point not to forget is that they're both in and of North Korea themselves. So their personal and organizational motivations always take a lower priority to the broader positions of their state. So this is in their minds and in their actions. So the motivations are passed down from the state above, but they also have their own bottom to top motivations. So we try and deal with those. In our everyday life, working life, our main partner is KITC, Korea International Travel Company. This organization was founded in 1953 as the country lay in ruins. Of course, there was no tourism in North Korea at the time, so their foundation was mainly to make the point that there was an institutional desire for tourism in the future. But they were the only state tourism operator for some time. Then they were joined by more organizations with different overlapping mandates. Youth Travel Company was initially for students. The Sports Travel Company was originally for visiting sports people. Later, even more of them were created. Taekwondo Travel Company, Pyongyang Koryo Travel Company, and they admired our work so much they decided to appropriate our name. There's a company focused on tours for admirers of ancient Korean culture, and so on. In reality, all of these companies compete amongst themselves and within themselves as well, in the case of the larger ones, for market share. Sorry, let me just stop there. They compete for market share, and in the case of the larger ones, they compete mainly for the lucrative Chinese market and the less lucrative so-called European market, which is everyone who's not Chinese as well. The key thing to note about our dealings with KITC and the department of that company that exists only to deal with Koryo tours is that we have no obligation to engage them on a political level. They're a company, and as such, they have the same motivation that any company does, which is profit. They sell their products and services for a higher price than they pay for them. They have to pay for hotel accommodation, meals for tourists, to train and employ their staff, to buy fuel for their vehicles, entry fees for attractions, and so on. Their mandate is to make money from this, and their management individually benefits from the performance of the sections they're in charge of. This sounds very familiar, of course, because this is basically how every company works. Of course, this being North Korea, there are political elements within the company, but the absence of a Ministry of Tourism exerting government oversight directly on the tourism industry. So it's mostly left to work within the restrictions imposed upon it by the laws of the country, which I mentioned earlier. And then they operate as a proper business while engaging in competition and seeking profit. Frankly, this makes KITC easy to deal with because we know the people who manage our department very well. We've worked with them for decades. We share motivations. We know each other and our desires and personalities intimately. And I can honestly say that we have deep trust in each other. As a result of the development of these relationships, we've been able to use this partnership to more effectively push for more and more access for tourists to North Korea, both to new places geographically and to open new experiences to visitors. This relationship is not always smooth, and there are times that KITC cannot get us the access that we believe they should be able to attain. Also, we've basically forced them to work with other organizations that we partnership with when they would ordinarily prefer just to do regular tourism and avoid the complications of having to work with other DPRK organizations. So I'm thinking here of our efforts to engage tourists in attending film screenings in Pyongyang at the Pyongyang International Film Festival, as well as the small cinema that we're involved in operating, both of which we work with a Korean film company on, as well as the Pyongyang Marathon, when we have to cooperate with the Marathon Committee, the National Olympic Committee, as well as with KITC. You would think that them all being North Koreans, they must all work together, but it is very much not the case. So yeah, ironically, given the assumption that they all share a common mind, not just an assumption, but something that they say over and over, it can be quite difficult to get different organizations there to work together or to even communicate with one another. It's far easier to have a competent and motivated go-between to basically filter the politics and North Korean sensitivities out of a situation in order to make things happen more efficiently and effectively. So I'd like to give an example of this. It's an event we organized in 2010, so 10 years ago now, to mark the 10th anniversary of the foundation of the British Embassy in Pyongyang. We organized a couple of football matches between the Middlesbrough Ladies Football Club and local opposition in Pyongyang. I'm going to put up a few pictures. Unfortunately, they are not very good, but I don't seem to have any good ones. So you'll just have to imagine what it's like. I'll scroll through these as I speak. So initially, this idea came to us as part of an ongoing project to engage in more sports in the country. We had and have arranged a number of, sorry, I can't seem to push that forward. There. We had and have arranged a number of friendly matches there in football against local opposition, in football not only, but ice hockey, volleyball, and we even introduced ultimate frisbee and cricket into the DPRK, sports that are yet to take off there. For this, though, for the 10th anniversary, we hope for something bigger. Now, Middlesbrough in the north of England is where the North Korean national football team, who took part in the 1966 World Cup, were based. So we'd taken their team of heroes from 66 back there in 2002, and they were given a very warm reception. The town hall even flew the DPRK flag for a day, which was unexpected. And this Middlesbrough women's team, they were very receptive and open to going to Pyongyang to continue to build this unique relationship between the cities. We had secured sponsorship, so economically and logistically from the outside, everything seemed set. However, KITC claimed that they were unable to arrange opposition at the level needed for this team to play against due to it being too big for them. They could arrange the visas, host the players as tourists, arrange all the usual logistics, but not the matches. So we went to the sports ministry, North Korean sports ministry, and we worked with them. This obviously has a more political flavor because they're a ministry, they're part of the government, but also technically the sports ministry is not actually in charge of football. So that would be the DPRK FA. So it got a bit confusing. It's a sport they're not supposed to have a hand or a foot in, but we still managed to make them agree to work with us. The sports ministry is not a business. Now, they're not motivated, at least explicitly, by money or profit, but they're mandated to promote the sports of the DPRK as well as to make the country look good. So we had to jump through a lot of hoops with them to assure them there's no political element to the trip, that the Middlesbrough team was up to the standard, because after all, women's football in North Korea is played at a much higher level than it is in the UK, and to make sure that they would be able to provide opposition, a stadium and so on for these matches. So we used the help of the UK embassy here with letters stating that the 10th anniversary of the embassy opening was a noted event in the UK and so on. Finally, these matches took place in the April 25th stadium in East Pyongyang with 7,000 or so locals in attendance in the rain, unfortunately. The Korean sides won convincingly. They were the best teams in the country with multiple international players. And the matches were even televised to a domestic audience of literally millions of people. One thing missing, sadly, from the TV version was the lap of honor that the Middlesbrough team did at the end of each game, shaking hands, high-fiving with hundreds of locals. And this was a genuinely touching moment, more significant than the matches themselves to me. And it's these moments of engagement that make all the difference, and hopefully that they will be remembered by the audience in attendance, even now, a decade or more later. There was also an evening party, which also a training session for young Korean players. There was an evening party which should have been a simple thing to throw together, but ended up being complicated due to all the different organizations in the mix. Getting different groups of people onto a boat in the Taedong River with the visiting and local teams, the UK embassy, some of the football heroes of 1966, some tourists, the sports ministry, is way more complicated than it should be. These matches and the whole event were a huge success for us, and we really felt like we'd done something very special and managed the motivations of the parties involved, as well as creating something positive, which had been witnessed by millions of North Koreans without making it a political event or having to get the visiting team involved in any ritual activities that they might not have wanted. However, it was slightly upset by one guy from the sports ministry sidelining Nick Bonner, my boss, and I, and telling us this was good, but why didn't you bring a team like Manchester United instead? Completely miscalculating the scale of the event, the budget, and so on. Anyway, we told him to, F off pretty quickly and carried on, celebrating. So the gap between the expectations of what may be possible and the realities of what can be done are still pretty huge among some people in North Korea who should know better, disappointingly. Since that time, we've continued to work with the sports ministry on the annual Pyongyang Marathon, an event which for decades didn't allow foreigners other than elite athletes to take part. Since 2014, we've been able to enter amateur runners, tourists basically, into the race, and we've worked with them to increase the professionalism of the event in terms of timing systems, opening different lengths of race, increasing time limits, etc., to make it more accessible and simply more fun. It's now an event which can attract upwards of 1,000 foreign runners over the last couple of races, which is a huge number for Pyongyang. The event also requires KITC and the sports ministry to work together. And again, this is done via our offices, which should make things harder, but generally does help to get it done. Now, these Middlesbrough football matches that I described, they serve as an example of a successful engagement event, one which brought North Koreans and foreigners together directly in person and indirectly through the TV, and contributed to making it clear that interaction can be non-political and non-aggressive on a human level. This is not the case, it is not the case that it always goes so well, though. I'd like to give a counterexample of an engagement-focused project that was unsuccessful, and this would be when we tried to take a group of Australians into the country to break a world record. So in 2008, North Korea finally got itself an entry in the Guinness Book of World Records. This was for the Arirang Mass Games, as the largest gymnastic display in the world for involving 100,090 performers at a show attended by a world records assessor in 2007. All very impressive, of course, and we were then told, or at least implied to, that North Korea was keen on getting itself some other world records. So at this time in China, there'd been a trend for various towns and cities to gain some minor fame by making the biggest bowl of noodles in the world or flying the longest kite in the world, very specific and very niche world records. We weren't sure what to suggest, though, and some time passed, and then a highly feasible opportunity landed in our laps. They're a group of Australian lads. They call themselves How Ridiculous, and they have a popular YouTube channel where they engage in all sorts of sporting trick shots and feats. And in June 2015, they had broken their own world record for the longest successful basketball shot from the top of the Gordon River Dam in Tasmania, 126.5 meters from the top into the basket at the bottom. So an Australian TV company reached out to us, and they thought it would be amazing to try and break this record in an urban setting in North Korea. We agreed this would be very special. They had looked in some other locations. A lot of cities have tall buildings, but it was hard to find somewhere with buildings tall enough and few enough people around the bottom, and being possible to close the streets a little bit, that it wouldn't be a logistical nightmare. And Pyongyang would be perfect because it has the buildings, it has the kind of population who are willing to accept if the street's closed that they have to walk around and so on. Plus, there is supposed to be a strong hunger to have a new record set in the DPRK. So the 4 buildings in Pyongyang that are tall enough to break this record, I'm going to show you some pictures now. I have to minimize that a little to make it mean I can advance it. Sorry for the technological delay. So the Ryugyong Hotel, the Jute Tower, the Pyongyang TV Tower, and the Yanggakdo Hotel, all of them would have worked. Our idea and our proposal was that locals get involved as much as possible. So not just spectators and viewers and people maybe watching it on TV after the fact, but as assistants in setting it up, as well as participants in the record bid. Basically, we hope to set up the basketball hoop and then take the Australian guys and as many locals as we could up to whatever building we were using, and they could all chuck some basketballs off, and eventually one of them would hit the target and set a world record. Now, of course, there's a skill in this, But at the end of the day, it's a numbers game. If you throw enough of them, one of them will hit. So it might be one of the Australians, or it could be a North Korean basketballer, or it could be a North Korean school kid. This would be a chance for someone there to break a world record publicly. And so that would fulfill our mandate of engagement, and it would give people things to talk about for a long time afterwards. So firstly, this building, the Pyongyang Hotel, was ruled out. Now, I've been to the top of that building, just showing off a little bit. Here's me a few years before that, and it is a spectacular view without a doubt. But permission to go back has been elusive, and it was thought too difficult. Also, as you can see from this picture, it's far too tall, more than 300 meters to the open platform at the top, meaning that you couldn't really see anything as small as a basketball hoop from all that way up. Plus, every shot would burst the ball as it landed, so that would limit how many attempts could be made. Plus, the shape of the building is roughly pyramidal, so you wouldn't really be able to throw the ball out without it just smashing into the building further down. So it was impractical and not allowed. Next up, the Pyongyang TV Tower. Now, back in the day, we used to take tourists to the restaurant here all the time. Amazing view, slightly dirty windows, small and slow lift, but really fantastic. And then some years ago, it was suddenly closed to visitors. We haven't been able to go back. We were told that it would be too sensitive to use this as a place to try and break a world record, which was a pity. The dream building is, of course, the Jute Tower. Now, this is 150 meters tall to the open-air viewing platform, and the lift inside is pretty reliable and fast enough, let's say, to ferry balls and participants to the top. It's an iconic structure, and it has a large open space below. Here's a picture of the open space below. These people would be asked to step aside, maybe. However, it was judged to be too political, which is a real blow, because setting a world record from the Jute Tower would have been very special. This left just the Yanggakdo Hotel, isolated on an island, tall enough, and with space below, plus it's surrounded by a river from which balls could be retrieved. Annoyingly, this simply stalled, and the applications for permission went nowhere. We inquired over and over about this, pointed out that if there really was a desire to get some more world records set in North Korea, that this would be among the easiest possible. Plus, it would be public and a lot of fun. But it never transpired, and the How Ridiculous crew had their record broken by some Americans before setting new records themselves at a dam in Switzerland, and then a 200-meter shot from a waterfall in Lesotho. So this was a real disappointment, and you know, the kind of thing that we thought we can definitely do this, and unfortunately we could not. It leaves very little gray area or wiggle room when everything is banned, apart from that which is not. So we've developed a bit of an expertise at finding these limited cracks and gaps to exploit and to gain more access, but still the general process for moving something from the no world into the yes world is slow and unreliable and endlessly frustrating. So when in the process of planning a trip to North Korea, or trying to get some project or another off the ground, asking why something is not allowed, as I said before, is missing the point. It's all not allowed, apart from that which is allowed. So you just have to comprehend that, basically. And I always have to take a moment during every meeting and on every tour to think it through and to see it with that baseline rule. Then, of course, I go home or to somewhere else where I have to remember that actually I can do what I want, apart from that which is not allowed. So it causes some cognitive dissonance sometimes, no matter how many times you've been to North Korea. Excuse me, that cold I mentioned. Apologies. Another organization we've worked with would be the Korea Film Production Company, which has gone by many names in its history. So we've directly produced 3 documentaries with their assistance, as well as the first UK DPRK co-production of the dramatic feature film Comrade Kim Goes Flying. I'll show you a couple of pictures involving that film here. Just it's more interesting to look at than me. I don't know if you've seen this, but I highly recommend it. So these films have been pleasures to work on, even though there's always some drama with filming in the country due to the sensitivities of various people and various organizations, or rather the sensitivities that they have to project on behalf of the state itself, in which they tend to act as conservatively as possible at all times. So when working on the script and the treatment for this film, Comrade Kim Goes Flying, which is a romantic comedy after all, we'd initially considered such comedy tropes as a love triangle or some kind of mistaken identity. Lazy, I know. But these were not permitted under the film code for apparently being against certain principles outlined in Kim Jong-il's book on the art of cinema. So despite having passed away some time earlier, we still had to work under the directions of Kim Jong-il, no questions asked. As a result, this romantic comedy doesn't have a great deal of romance, and many of the comedy parts seemed inappropriate. But still, the core plot of the film is about a lady coal miner who dreams of becoming an acrobat at the famous Pyongyang circus. Now, there are many North Korean films in which someone has a dream, but generally they're dissuaded from selfishly pursuing this dream and instead realize that the correct and best thing to do is to show some self-sacrifice and work for the benefit of society, the community, the regiment, the collective farm, etc. Now, this kind of plot is typical of DPRK cinema. So in Comrade Kim Goes Flying, spoiler alert here, we have our heroine being advised by others to give up this silly dream and work in the mines for the good of the nation. She rejects this advice and strives to overcome adversity and become an acrobat. This simple message, which is ubiquitous in almost all cinema made outside of North Korea, is one that is completely different to the general message that you see in similar films inside the country. And it's this message that we wanted to get across, a more individualistic one than people there are used to. The system and the framework of filmmaking in North Korea force you to make a propaganda film through following the directives in the book I mentioned, having to have a political speech in there and so on. So as a result, we produce something that to North Korean eyes is quite distinct in message to other films made there, even though to outsiders it might just look like yet another North Korean work of propaganda. It also won the Best Director Award at the Pyongyang International Film Festival, and here are two of the co-directors receiving that award. So working on our films, as well as multiple other projects, mainly arranging different documentary shoots, let's say, with the film company in Pyongyang can be a challenge too. There was a time when they switched from fax to email in around 2007, and a couple of years later, they just decided to switch back because they thought fax was simpler, after which time we'd already forgotten how to send a fax. As with most of what we do, it's actually simpler to deal with people there by phone or in person, by phone when we're not there in person. On the subject of being there in person, on the subject of being there in person while working with more than one local organization as a partner. Now, this creates problems far bigger than it really should. Technically speaking, when you're invited to North Korea, it's the responsibility of the inviting partner agency to host you as a visitor. So if I go to the DPRK as a guest of KITC, but while I'm there, I want to meet with another partner we have, the Sports Ministry, the Olympic Committee, film company, or anyone else really, this is not really permitted. I'd need to leave the country, get another visa supported by one of those organizations just to come in and to speak to them. I'm actually going to throw up a little slideshow of some pictures of me in North Korea, just so you don't have to stare at me, if I can even find that. Gosh, sorry about this. No, I can't. How terrible. Sorry, well, maybe apologies, let me just find it on my screen. No, I tell you what, I won't. I'll just go without. So obviously this is not an ideal situation, having to enter and exit and re-enter the country just to speak to someone different, not to mention being exceptionally silly. We get around this basically by simply developing good personal as well as professional relationships with each of our partners, making sure that at least they know each other, even if they can't directly work together. And then we leverage this relationship for various chance meetings, joint sessions in hotel meeting rooms, and so on. Some organizations and staff are more flexible than others, and when it's a challenge, sometimes we just have to push hard. But in general, we have a system in place that enables us to speak to various organizations and move forward on plans while not having to constantly be moving in and out of the DPRK, wearing a different hat each time. So I hope that this presentation has given you some new information on how the processes work when working with a handful of different North Korean organizations. Of course, not all of them are the same. We don't work with all of them, just a small fraction. There's no single process for working with quote unquote North Korea itself, as it's simply not as monolithic as we usually imagine it from the outside, nor is it as infused with this so-called single-hearted unity that they themselves trumpet from the inside. Different organizations have competing and overlapping interests, different areas of influence and motivation. Still, generally speaking, they're held back by a kind of institutional conservatism and a tendency away from anything that they perceive to be the slightest bit risky, as well as by the rules and regulations of their own country. Even so, as I've outlined, some successes have been achieved and some failures have been suffered, and I hope there'll be many more of both. I've definitely not meant to suggest in this presentation that tourism and the small-scale engagement efforts that we work in will bring great and lasting change to North Korea. This is not what I believe or what I meant to suggest or imply at all. We think, as I said at the beginning, that incremental gains can be made over time with patience and a realistic approach to what can be achieved. And the lesson we've learned is to not melt down or collapse when difficulties or barriers are faced. So a lot of my evidence for seeing how engagement efforts in the country have affected people are just anecdotal, but they are a real thing. And to do anything at all to take away control of the entire message of what foreigners are like, and what they think and believe from the North Korean machinery of news and propaganda, and instead to present a more true, varied and real face, even for a small time and on a small scale, is an act that works against these narratives of negativity that are far too ubiquitous in the DPRK when it comes to showing local people what foreigners are like. So it's a long journey to make a real difference, but it is a journey of single steps taken one at a time. And I hope I've been able to outline how we've taken some of these steps to you this evening. Sorry, thank you very much for your attention and your allowance. And I do hope that this was of some interest to you. And I would welcome any questions, any points for clarification, and so on. Thank you again.
Great. Thank you, Simon. That was very interesting to me. I'll start off the questions. How do North Koreans view people such as me who can speak Korean? If I were to go on a visit there and converse in Korean, how would they react to that?
So it's the language of the country. I would encourage you doing it as much as possible. It would be appreciated. I think most people there either believe that it's almost impossible for foreigners to learn Korean, or that it's just so rare that it's notable. I know people who speak Korean who go there often get concerned that they'll think I'm a spy, they'll think this, they'll think that, but I haven't found that to be true at all. It does help when people are explaining you can't go for a walk because you can't speak Korean. If you then say, well, actually I can, and they have to scramble to find another explanation. A few years ago, I went to the opening ceremony for the Wonsan Kalma tourist development area. So this is not just the new buildings. This was the whole area, these mega plans to inject foreign capital in, and everyone gets rich and happy. And of course, none of that happened. And at the presentation, which was held at Mount Kumgang, the only non-Chinese or North Koreans, so myself and Michael Spavor, who has addressed this RAS before. And most of the Chinese there were Chinese Koreans. And they asked, look, if I'm called to invest in this place, the millions of dollars you're asking for, am I able to do things such as I can do in Rason in the far northeast? Can I go around without someone taking me around? Because it's pretty inconvenient and I don't really appreciate it. And the panel on the stage, they couldn't give a straight answer. They had to go into conference for about 10 minutes and say, well, look, no, you can't, because we're a welcoming country to foreigners, and if you can't speak Korean, then it's really inconvenient. And the guy had asked the question in Korean, and Michael at this point stood up and just said, well, look, I can speak Korean, so can I go around? And this caused more delays and so on. And it did show up the whole, just general short-sightedness of this policy. And if you're going to have a policy and the excuse for it is so falsifiable, maybe you should have, come up with some other explanation. So in brief, I know I didn't really answer that question. I would encourage you to do it. People do appreciate it. People are impressed, and people think it's cool. So go for it.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Any other questions? The floor is open, and we've got plenty of time. Okay, John sends a question through the chat. Could you talk a little bit more about Michael Spavor? What did you think of his work, and any comments about his predicament?
I may not have mentioned where I am at the beginning of this talk, but it was mentioned in the Facebook page. So I'm sure that you will understand and appreciate that some of that might be best for me to say simply that I'm on the same page as all of you are on that. I know Michael a long time, and I was a big supporter and remain a big supporter and fan of the work that he did in North Korea. I worked with him on a number of projects, on the Rodman project and on a bunch of other stuff, and I thought that he had absolutely the right attitude to working there, and I hope that he can do it again.
Thank you. Emily Williams, you have a question.
Yes, I just want to kind of jump on Steve's question, and it's the opposite. I look Korean because I'm an adoptee, but I don't speak Korean very well. Do you think that that would cause a problem because I look Korean?
No, it's not a problem. I mean, that's something that's not so commonplace, but it's fairly common on tours we have. We've taken quite a number of Korean adoptees and overseas Koreans, let's say, along on the tours, and it's really not an issue at all. Actually, no problem. I mean, the tour guides you have, they speak as a default for our company English, but you can also get tour guides who speak French, German, Japanese, Chinese, Russian, Polish, Bulgarian, Hungarian, Spanish, and other languages as well. But no, it's not an issue at all. People are interested in the overseas adoptees story, and of course they have a highly politicized narrative about, let's call it baby selling. But I think that North Koreans there that I know have always found it interesting when they meet people of their greater Korean family with very different backgrounds and very different life experiences. So I would say go for it as well, and don't worry about the language.
Thank you.
Okay, here's another question. Could you explain a little bit more about that anecdote regarding the two types of guides?
Yeah, so there aren't two types of guides. There are many, many types of guides, but there is a belief from outside that there's one type of guide, rigid, minder, a government operative, that kind of thing. But in reality, some of them are awful, horrible people. Most of them are very, very nice, and some of them are super lovely. It is possible to get to know them very well. Of course, it's easy for me to say that because I've been there 182 times. So I see a lot of people over and over and over. And it's easy to say my North Korean friends, but the reality is that it's hard to make true friends there. But I would say I have a small handful of people I would consider my mates, people who I don't really have to watch what I say with, and so on. So you can make friends there. You can have relationships with people that you get along with, who you would call your friends, who maybe in another context would not be. So what I'm saying is that there's millions of different types, or many different types. They have different interests. Now, the guy who was complaining to me about the new guides in his company was basically kicking up a mini fuss because in his era, most of the guides were men. They'd been through a similar experience. They'd been through the army. They had more political education and political background. And so they knew kind of the ins and outs of the Jute idea and its precursor politics, dialectical materialism, Marxism, Leninism. And he thought that the 23-year-old women who were now making up most of the new guides were frivolous, and they were interested in, pop music and drinking peach juice. And the peach juice thing was very apt because a lot of young women I know in North Korea, they do like to drink peach juice, but he had just used this as a marker. If people are familiar with late 90s English football, it's a bit like being a prawn sandwich eater. And if that doesn't make sense to anyone, I don't know. It probably works in many other sports as well, but it means somebody who's not as serious or as dedicated to the deeper principles as others. There are room for all.
Here's another question. If people know South Korea, how do they express any curiosity about South Korea?
Yes, sometimes. Not so much. I mean, we take quite a lot of people who live in South Korea or who have experience in South Korea. And I would say it's rare for people visiting North Korea to have not been to South Korea. So it's perfectly common and it's perfectly normal to make comparisons, even though the places are rather different. There are, of course, similarities, not least language, some cuisine, historical background, and so on. So people there, they do express some interest, but a combination of doing this job over and over and over, so you're not the first person they've met who has some knowledge of South Korea. And also being aware that they are in North Korea and they are North Koreans will perhaps hold them back. So if you meet a North Korean in North Korea and you say, I live in Seoul, they're not going to go, oh my God, tell me all about it. What's it like? Is it true that there are buildings 1,000 stories high, but yet everyone else is starving in the street, or anything like that? Their view of it will be much more sophisticated than most people expect, but still not very accurate, which is probably true of anywhere. So again, I would caution anyone against making their entire personality on a tour, I'm from South Korea, because that's boring and not that impressive, because you might not be the only one and everyone's heard it before. But there's no reason not to interject with comparative or contradictory experiences you've had. But if every conversation you have is, yeah, this kimchi's not as good as the one at Mrs. Park's down the road, or this soju tastes like petrol and the soju I'm used to isn't, that's again, that can be a bit of a diss. Not everything's better in the South. The beer is better in the North, and the mass events are better in the North as well. So there's at least those two things.
Here's a comment. One North Korean guy that I met showed interest in the story of King Sejong and his Hangul. I would think the story might be commonly known as part of the heritage there, not?
Yeah, I don't. Is that a question? Sorry, I mean,
Emily, do you want to elaborate on that?
I mean, like, because there's actually North Korea, at least 8 years ago, they were sending a lot of North Koreans to Paris to learn French and architecture. And I happened to meet some of them in my class, and they actually, none of them were really interested. It was answering to Algie Lacey's question, but like they didn't really seem interested. And I think that was because, they knew they were being watched since they were abroad. But also, like, there was one guy and he was interested in like a drama that I had like done for a presentation. But I mean, he just, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's quite possible. People know when they're overseas how to behave, whether it's because, I think it's a little broad to say they're being watched. I mean, people know how to behave, and then they know the requirements. They're trained when they go abroad. So, and they take, as I outlined, really the most conservative position. So sadly, that's true. And you may find that something like a shared history, I may be very naive on this, but the general history of King Sejong inventing a very admirable written form is uncontroversial. So that's the kind of thing that you could make common ground on. If you were to talk about, let's say, the foundation of the final dynasty, where the view of the Joseon dynasty or the Lee dynasty, as they call it there, is quite different, that you might find a bit more contentious with North Koreans. But if you can find a little bit of non-political, non-dangerous ground to talk about with any North Koreans you meet overseas, you'll find them to be a bit more open, I think.
Okay, Simon Haywood.
Hi. Yeah, I was just curious as to what your view is on when tourism will probably reopen. Obviously, I think it's largely contingent on what China does. So have you got any sort of indications on that front?
No, in a word, good question. So they closed in January. I mean, they don't ask the permission of China, but of course, yeah, the border which almost everyone crosses to enter and exit the country is the Chinese one. They closed in January. At the time, it seemed an overkill. We were saying, well, just because a few people sneeze, suddenly you close the border. But they were ahead of the game on this one. And they've said, it's been reported in North Korea that a statement was made that they won't open until there's a cure. Of course, they can roll that back if there's a system in place where people can be tested. That would probably be good enough, but there isn't. And even though here in China, the outbreak is very much contained. I mean, whether we go in for the official numbers or not, this time round, it seems more accurate. Even so, they're not going to want it in North Korea. They report 0 cases. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. It's easy to assume that it's not, but who knows? So I would guess next spring at best, yeah. But we just don't know. I mean, yeah, we're hoping.
Thanks. Cheers.
Okay, great. Thank you. I've got a whole list of things in the chat, so let me start ticking those off.
I'll try and answer a bit quicker.
Okay. Can you go hiking or exploring in the forests and mountains?
Mountains, yes. You can't just go off willy-nilly. You know, you still have to go on hiking trails that exist. So at Myohyang-san, at Chilbo-san, at Kungang-san especially, there's long hiking trails there that can take, you know, the whole day of long hiking. A little bit at Paektusan and in some other places as well. So yeah, there are some opportunities for hiking, but you can't just get your rucksack on, set off from Pyongyang, and see you in Rason in 3 weeks. Not like that.
Could you talk a little bit about Otto Warmler? Do you have any inside information about what might have really happened? Could you talk
No,
about
not really. I mean,
how it affects your business?
I don't have any inside information because he didn't travel with us, and I believe that most of the real story is in the public domain. I mean, I know there's a lot of guesswork and speculation, but I think that most of what there is to know is known. It affected our business because, of course, it caused because it's a piece of tragic and horrifying news. I mean, you know, it's just unbelievably awful. Now, he wasn't the first person to be detained, but he's the first person to be detained and come back no longer living. So this had a great effect on the business. It caused essentially a collapse. People were fearful, people were terrified, confused, and so on. And over time, the business and the market generally built back up. And then in 2017, the US government decided to simply ban Americans from going to North Korea. And this wiped out 20% of our market, which is, as I alluded to earlier, the so-called European market, which basically means everyone who's not Chinese. Yeah. That was made up 20% of Americans. That just disappeared overnight. And so that had a great effect. I had a meeting with the body which is above KITC, above our partner. And I said, you know, this is problematic, you know, so be aware that this will cause a fall in tourism numbers. And they told me it'll be made up by like anti-American people who, you know, they just want to go on holiday somewhere where there are no Americans. And I just said, look, this is so absurd. How can you possibly think that this is true? Like, where did these people go on holiday? But this was a strong belief of theirs, and they were wrong about it. So, yeah, that was the main effect on the business. Is it caused a collapse, and then it caused another mini collapse.
Here's another one. Have you ever met any of the American soldiers who defected to North Korea?
We made a movie about them, Crossing the Line. This was a film that, you know, my name's in the credits, thanks to me. So I haven't met them myself, but Nick, my boss, who popped up in here earlier, he's there. I can see his name. He met them and knew them because they're no longer with us very well, visiting their homes and so on. I, a few years ago, was roped into appearing in a film with the son of one of the sons of Joe Dresnok. This is while Joe Dresnok himself was still alive. And I asked his son about how he was doing, and he said he didn't have long to go, basically. And unfortunately, that film was never released, so I'm still not much of a matinee idol in North Korea.
What do you say to people who look at the tourists who have been detained and are fearful that the North Koreans randomly arrest tourists?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's everyone, right? I mean, everyone, if you are going to North Korea and you haven't heard of these stories, then what on earth are you thinking? You should know about these and you should read up on them, but you should read up on the reality and the truth. Fact is that I don't know of a single case of random or arbitrary detention of tourists there, but I do know of several cases, they're all in the public domain, the same ones that you know about, of people who've been detained for something. Now, the something they're detained for is always something which you shouldn't be detained for. At the very worst, you should just be able to say sorry and maybe write a note saying, you know, I apologize, and then maybe kicked out of the country. But in no cases that I know of were these random or not a reaction to something. Now, distributing religious material, destroying a visa, these things are illegal in North Korea, and it's known that they're illegal. If somebody went to the country with the company that took them there and didn't tell them this in advance, then I would be just amazed. That's not the action of a responsible organization. So I think what people should do is look at the facts and realize that if you don't do anything illegal, then you will be fine. But whether you agree with the laws there or not, they are still the laws. So if you cannot go without taking in religious material and spreading it around, don't go. You know, don't do that, please. And if you have to take something, it doesn't matter how drunk you are or what situation you find yourself in. Don't do it. Simple as that.
Thank you for the great presentation. Any groups can get into the country for more than a year, to what extent does it harm North Korea's economy and your own economic situation?
Oh, I mean, I'm just drinking water here. I'm normally drinking cognac, you know. I mean, it's ruinous for our business. We have had about 4 tourists this year. I mean, they closed the border in January. All the other countries we run tours to, they're all closed as well. So yeah, we have almost no income. If you know, we've been working on a few projects, such as we've been advertising this wash your hands piece of propaganda art that I can see on my screen behind one gentleman there. And also we've been helping the artist who helped produce this amazing map of Pyongyang. Anyone who's interested in this, please let me know and I can send the relevant links. So, we've been creating content for our website, social media, doing some talks, podcasts, and so on. But yeah, I mean, we're a travel company. We rely upon people going on tours, and no one can go on tour. So disastrous for us. For North Korea, they don't rely on tourism. For all the tourism props up the government arguments, they can cancel it at any time. And of course, there are thousands of people directly and indirectly employed by the tourism industry, but there are millions of people in the country. So I'm sure it's not very good for them to close their borders, but there are bigger problems they have than tourism. They'll want, you know, trade before they want a handful of tourists back in. Even at its peak, the number of tourists going in for the European market would be 4,000 or 5,000 in a year, and for the Chinese market, 200,000 to 300,000, which is much bigger numbers than most people expect. But still, that's Mickey Mouse. I mean, that's nothing. It's nothing compared to Jeju or Thailand or something like that. Really nothing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, working back on our chat list. Thank you for your talk today. Most interesting. One of the first points you tried to handle was to rebuff the thought that by going to North Korea, a tourist might somehow be supporting the government. Do you think that is absolutely not the case, or is it difficult to answer?
I mean, if somebody goes on tour to North Korea and they are a supporter of the government, then they may see it as an act that supports the government, but it doesn't innately support the government. I mean, I know this is a common thing that people believe, but they wouldn't apply it to almost anywhere else. I'm not a fan of the what about argument, but it's hard to avoid because it's a handy one sometimes. But no one's going to ask me, oh, you're sitting in Beijing, so that must mean you're a supporter of everything the Chinese government does. Why wouldn't they ask that? Because it's stupid. It doesn't make any sense to ask that. But yet, the very act of going to North Korea is seen by many people as supportive of the state. Now, is it economically supportive? Perhaps in a way, because you spend money, as I mentioned, you spend money there, goods and services have a cost, the companies that you deal with, they have a profit motive, and some of that money makes its way back to the center, let's say, in the form of tax. Of course, it's a tax-free country, so they say, but there are many ways of charging tax, and some of that money goes to the center. They're not, but you can't decide what your tax goes on. So you're spending money on roads and hospitals and schools and prisons and nuclear weapons, etc. But again, that's true everywhere. You can't determine where your contribution to the center goes. So I believe that, you know, the pennies that you put into the pot there are far outweighed by the acts of working against the main narratives, as most of my talk was about in North Korea. So I hope that helps. It's supportive if you are a supporter of the government, but honestly, if you are, you should probably be going with a friendship organization or something like that.
Yeah, good. Stephen Epstein has put a link in the chat column about mountain hiking in North Korea. So I recommend.
Yeah, this would be with Roger Shepard.
For you to look at that.
Right. It's Roger.
Yeah.
Okay. Emily, you've got another question here. What do you think the probability of finding an organization that would allow for research on North Korean regional food? Possibility of finding an organization in Emily, you want to clarify that question?
Yeah, I mean, that's just as it sounds, because I had written a paper on North Korean food, but from here, using as much research as possible. But I'm just wondering, like, should I, in the case that in the future I wanted to like do something more in depth, do you think that'd be possible, you know, to find an organization like you were saying?
No. In a word, I think that's highly unlikely. I can't think of any. There are various kind of cultural outreach organizations, but I can't think of any offhand. I mean, I wouldn't know who to pitch it to be honest. Call the Unification Ministry and hope that they're having a good day. But I wouldn't hold out too much hope for it. Food is also very sensitive there. But take what I say with a pinch of salt. I run a travel company, so I don't know about this, but my gut feeling is that that would be very hard to do properly for the time being.
Here's a question from a man who's apparently been to North Korea. He said, is the $100 note the bellhop at the Yangakdo asked me to swap for one of mine counterfeit? Is the $100 bill that he swapped with a bellhop counterfeit?
Did he include a picture of that $100
No,
bill?
don't have a photo.
Then
the bellhop apparently had a $100 note and he swapped for another $100 note. Do you want, Bobby, do you want
I don't know, did it have a picture of President Clinton on it or something? I mean, it's possible that I mean, I'm just trying to think, why would you swap 100 for 100? Was it ripped or damaged? Or was it one of the old small head ones? Because they don't have much viability in North Korea. Other than that, how should I know? I mean, 100 for 100 is not much of a deal. But also, I mean, honestly, you don't come across tons of counterfeit money floating around there. So I don't know, honestly, no idea. Hold it up to the light.
Yeah, see if the watermark's there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Sometimes it's not easy to spot the counterfeits when you're not a banker.
If it's indistinguishable from the real thing, then it is the real thing, quite possibly.
Maybe,
so
yep,
I don't know.
Yeah. Have you seen the K-drama Crash Landing? Any comment on the portrayal of North Korea?
I honestly haven't watched it, and I do try and take an interest in things, but I mean, I'm not a huge fan of K-drama, and I know that this one, if I'm going to watch one, it should be this one. And I was chatting with a friend about this a couple of days ago, Andre Abrahamian, who some people here may know, and Andre told me watch the first episode. So I will watch it, but I'm sorry, I haven't seen it. I know some colleagues of mine have seen it, and they were quite impressed with some elements of it. Attention to detail, some phone numbers in it that looked right, you know, the little things that you wouldn't expect, and then not so impressed with other parts of it. But it's not passing itself off as a documentary. It's a drama, you know, it's a bit of fun as well. So I'm sure it's good.
Isn't it time to refresh the friendship between Kim Jong-un and Dennis Rodman? Do you see a future chance of this?
Dennis Rodman is an American, and his own government therefore bans him from going to North Korea, so he's not able to go. I mean, I know Dennis fairly well, and I've seen him quite a lot, more recently on trips to China as well, more recently than his last trips to North Korea. I mean, he hasn't seen Kim Jong-un since that basketball, that night in Pyongyang, the basketball event. I think he's to be applauded for being gutsy enough to go and do it. He admitted that he didn't know that there was a North Korea in the first place. I think sometimes that kind of naivety can work for you. He never claimed to be a specialist. He never claimed to be taking all the solutions over, but at least he brought a kind of humanity. And in singing Happy Birthday to Kim Jong-un, he put that on TV over and over again for weeks. And he also, he hugged Kim Jong-un, something that pictures of that appeared in North Korean media. This, brings a bit of humanity. And I think that's what's missing. So I think it is time for him to renew that. So go, Dennis. I'm totally behind you. Go for it.
Okay, well, here's another link. that just popped up.
It's a piece that Chris Green and I wrote about Crash Landing on You,
Oh, okay.
and discusses a lot of the perceptions that, say, Talbukja and others have of the show.
Okay. Yep. All right. So I commend everybody to look at those links in the group chat. Look at them
I
now
will
or
do
copy them now, because when we end the conversation, they disappear.
Maybe you
So,
can post them on that Facebook page as well, perhaps.
well, maybe we could. That means I have to copy and paste, which I can do.
Or I can send on.
Oh, hey, yeah, Stephen, send them to the office address for us, please. Would you do that?
Or I could post it on the notice about this
Okay,
particular
yeah.
show
Okay.
on the RAS page. I'll do that.
Yeah, okay, yeah, do that. Yeah, please. Thank you very much. All right, okay, well, let's see. Oh, just curious, can people go to North Korea for scientific research?
People do. I mean, this isn't something that we're engaged in, but I've met people there who were engaged in scientific research. I mean, one that I remember very well was up at Mount Baekdu. There's an international group of volcanologists, I believe the term is, and I ran into them in Pyongyang while they were shopping for their trip. I'm not sure what year this was. It was when I met Werner Herzog there at the same time, the film director who was shooting a documentary there. So there was a British volcanologist, a Chinese one, and so on. And they were going there to basically see if the mountain is unstable or about to pop, basically. So there are cases of people doing scientific research. I think it depends what it is, basically, and again, who you're partnering with and what if any, political element there is to it. Best if there's none.
What about student exchanges, university, whatever?
Yeah, those exist to a small extent. Of course, there are some foreigners studying in Pyongyang longer term, mostly at Kim Il-sung University, mostly Chinese and some Russians. And of course, a lot of people here will know about Alex Sigley and him and his studying there, and a handful of other non-Chinese or Russian students there. Most student exchanges there, the ones that I've been involved in, have been short-term. Language courses of up to 3 weeks, let's say, or taking in school groups to spend a day or a couple of days, or sometimes more, with their contemporaries in North Korea. Now, we'd like this to be more and have more engagement, but the problem is they're so strict about their curriculum and they can't have it disrupted, even to the point where it's common for tourists to go to a school and find an English lesson if one is going on. It's not staged for you. There's loads of English lessons. If there's an English lesson, you'd think, oh, the teacher, of course, will disrupt this, because suddenly here's a load of people who can speak English, whether native or foreign, which is even better, and they'll get so much more exposure. But after 5 minutes, quite often the teachers are like, look, we've got to teach this lesson on the Leaning Tower of Pisa, or this lesson on some other inconsequential thing, because they're mandated to perform the curriculum, which is such a missed opportunity. So it can be quite hard to get past this, institutional mindset. So there are some student exchanges, but it depends what you're looking for, really, if it's something short or long, and so on.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Simon. Fascinating discussion tonight. I learned a lot.
That's quite all right. By the way, I just noticed there's another question, someone asking if they can speak on the mic.
Oh,
which I
yeah,
think
of
is
course,
okay,
yeah.
right?
Where am I missing that?
That's
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Mason here. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Simon, for a fascinating presentation. My question is, like when the guides are speaking, and I know different guides are different, but kind of in general, referencing Korean history, do they kind of give a noticeably northern perspective? And I don't mean the modern stuff, 20th century. I mean like that Goguryeo kingdom was much superior to those traitorous southern Shilla kingdom, that unified China, or that the Goryeo dynasty was far superior to the traitorous southern Joseon dynasty, et cetera, et cetera. do they put a noticeable twist on this, as we do get from some North Korean books about history and things like that?
Yeah, basically, in a word. I mean, I'm no specialist in Korean history, but I know my bits, and I know that they do take what you described, basically, David, as a northern view. Let's say if something happened in the north or from people of the north, it's innately better than people of the south. I mean, this is probably not unique to North Korea. I mean, anywhere that's had civil strife or anything like that, we still have Yorkists and Lancastrians in the UK after all. So people will sort of back their area, let's say, their native spot. I think generally speaking, they probably take, for like a high school level, the main approaches. They go in for like this happened and then this happened and then this happened. There's not really room for reformist history or anything like that, and everything's got to have some kind of revolutionary element to it. But yeah, there's certainly differences in the way it's presented, but I don't think that they're irreconcilable.
You know that they did reconstruct this giant tomb for Dangun outside of Pyongyang, and they do kind of officially say that Dangun is a real thing. Do they tell anything about Dangun to the foreign tourists? Do they bring it up?
Not that much. Most foreign tourists not really that interested in it. I mean, most foreign tourists are there to go to North Korea, right? Yeah. The DPRK. And of course, people are interested in a bit of the history, but the history is long and it's confusing and it's complicated, So there will be a bit of background given. Very few tourists go to the tomb of Dangun. That tomb is rebuilt, you politely said, and it's just outside Pyongyang. You can go there and you can pay to have the casket open and see the bones of a mythical figure. So you can do that if you want. Almost nobody does. The drive there is quite interesting. It's okay. If you go up to Mount Baekdu, of course, you get more Dangun stories. But this in many ways legitimizes the current rulers of the country, because who was born in Mount Baekdu? Kim Jong-il. And who was born in Pyongyang, the place where Dangun founded his capital and is now buried? Kim Il-sung. So it all works to legitimize the North as the more Korean. As everyone knows, I don't think it's controversial to say that there's a contest for authenticity and legitimacy between the North and South. And you'll see in North Korea, a lot of people will say, we don't dye our hair. A lot of men in their 60s with jet black hair, they will dye their hair, but only black, right? People don't take English names, right? The only people who have English names, they're nicknames or they're, joke names. They're not, they won't take an English name. They don't miscegenate, let's say. There's no people mixing with foreigners in the adult way. And, they'll make a big deal out of, we've had 5,000 years of history of a homogeneous society, very strong bloodlines, ignoring the fact that it's also, they make a big deal out of having been invaded so many times. But of course, none of these invaders left any genetic material behind, despite the fact that a lot of people's surnames are suspiciously Chinese and so on. So, these are things that you can observe there and little contradictions that you can pick up on. But yeah, part of the legitimacy of North Korea is being more Korean than South Korea. So if you consider it a virtue to be more Korean, that's the place.
Well, excellent. Thank you very much. A big hand of applause for Simon. We've had a great discussion tonight. We appreciate your time joining us from Beijing. Our next lecture will be Tuesday, October 13th at 7:30 p.m. Dale Quarrington, who has visited and photographed more than 500 Buddhist temples in Korea, will share highlights of both the beautiful and the weird. We hope to see you all then. Thanks again very much and have a good evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you.